everybody. Welcome to the very special Vermont Restaurant Week edition of The Dish. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and celebrating this very flavorful week. My name is Corey Renninger from 7 Days. Tonight's event is a benefit for the Vermont Food Bank. They're here promoting their food evening. So if you'd like to sign up, you can do so. I'm happy to report, so this is our 10th year for Vermont Restaurant Week. And over the last 10 years, I'm very proud to say that we have raised over $122,000 for the Vermont Food Bank, which is pretty incredible. And it's because of all of you coming out and supporting these events that we were able to make that all possible. So thank you again for showing them some love. Speaking of showing some love, Vermont Federal Credit Union is our presenting sponsor, and they have been the presenting sponsor all 10 years. So if you could please give some love to the Vermont Federal Credit Union, that would be awesome. We also have additional support from Vermont Creamery, who is also here sampling some of their delicious products. The Essex Culinary Resort and Spa. City Market is also in the house. Burlington Beer Company, Whistle Pig Whiskey, and Shacksbury Cider. Burlington Beer, Whistle Pig, and Shacksbury Cider are all available at the bar tonight, so if you haven't had a chance to try any of their products, please do so. We also have support from the Vermont Department of Tourism, Front Porch Forum, The Point, and WCAX. So The Dish is part of a series organized by the Intervale Center and City Market. This is their 16th dish, which is awesome. Yeah! And they happen twice a year, so the next one will be in November, so save the date, topic to be determined. Can talk to both of them over there. And afterwards, if you're feeling hungry, ArtsRiot has a lot of pickled items on their menu, including a rice and kimchi dish, pickled eggs, a kimchi broccoli bowl, and I've been told that the hot and sour beef pho has some delectable yum-yums in it. So if you're feeling inspired after tonight's discussion, you can head over next door and grab some food. Other than that, that is all I have for you tonight. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy the panel discussion. And now I will turn things over to Amy, who will be our moderator this evening, and she will introduce our other panelists. Thank you.
Is this on? Oh, yes. Hello. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to moderate this panel on fermentation. There is so much creativity and know-how at this table. And so I think I wanted to start, just have each person introduce yourself, just your name, and then perhaps where you work, and then the particular product that you're most invested in fermenting. And then we'll go on from there.
Hello, good evening. I'm Jason Elberson, owner of Sobremesa. We make kimchis and sauerkrauts in our commercial kitchen on our farm in Marshfield, Vermont. I suppose I'm most proud, and our most popular product is our traditional kimchi, spicy and has a little fish sauce. We also have a vegan, less hot version. So that's me.
Hello, I'm Heike, and I'm the bakeress at Brot, Bakehouse School and Kitchen, and we are, I would say like almost exclusive sourdough bakery. We are mostly teaching classes on sourdough baking up in Fairfax, a little bit north of here, but we also open up the bakery in the summer once a week for people to stop by and pick up breads from our wood-fired oven. So if you happen to be in the area, please stop by, and that's what we do, only sourdough baking.
I'm Doug, I'm chef at Hotel Vermont, Blue Northeast Seafood. Not one specific product that we ferment. We make hot sauce and creme fraiche. We have a house gin. we, have a lot to do with beer. So, fermented foods are just part of our general repertoire, and something that we use as ingredients more than a specific product.
Hi, my name is Kate Turcotte. I'm the cheesemaker and owner at Orb Weaver Creamery. We're sampling some cheese over there, and my husband and I recently took over Orb Weaver from Marjorie Marion. It's one of the oldest farmstead cheesemakers in Vermont. They started in 1981. So that's what I do as my side hustle. And then during the day, I am the quality manager at Aqua Vitea. So I think there's a Vermont saying that behind every successful dairy farm is a wife that works in town. So that's where we're holding on to that.
Thank you. First I'm just going to provide some maybe slightly meditative things to think about in terms of fermentation, and then I'm going to ask a sort of meditative question of everybody, and then we're going to get more into some of the pragmatics of fermentation and having a business related to fermentation in Vermont. So I will say that to preview, I'm going to talk about what is really sort of a truth about not just the acts of fermentation, but any act of transformation of making food or making drink, which I will cheerfully say is Brad Kaler of Windfall Orchard's line, which is we are all, whenever we are involved in making food or making drink, in the race against rot. So, right, because you are always with food, as long as we have yet to really take on pills and petri dishes as our primary ways of consuming food, it's always about products of the natural world that we are killing, and then they are decaying. And a lot of the work that we have to do is manage the decay. So this is sort of what I would call a universal truth. And actually, everyone here has some thoughts about, I think, this as well. So I have a colleague who, there's some people who have written about this, about fermentation in this light, that I just want to give you a couple ways to think about this, because I think oftentimes, because most Americans are not engaged in this sort of race against rot in an everyday way. It tends to be a race against maybe what's in the back of your produce bin every once in a while, but you don't necessarily always think on an everyday basis, oh, what I'm really doing here is trying to preserve what is about to go into the ground again in compost. But fermentation is really about that, and all these people are sort of in a very particular relationship to this process. But it is a process that all humans, in a sense, share when they're trying to feed themselves or have liquids for themselves, in a sense. So in that sense, one thing you can say is that we are always trying to both destroy life and actually create life simultaneously when you're in the acts of fermentation. And in some ways, a lot of what fermentation is the process of limiting and controlling, but also embracing spoilage. And that a lot of times what you're doing in fermentation is you're trying to stop some forms of decay and some forms of spoilage and to enhance others. And a lot of that is to enhance flavor and to stop things that could possibly really do damage to you. So we're trying to enhance the positive and pleasurable forms of decay, and we're trying to stop the ones that could make us decay in ways that we don't want them to have happen. So it's this kind of idea that decay is as life-giving as it is life-taking that is a really interesting thing about fermentation. And I think if you do work and with fermented products, you think about that in a lot of different ways. And you're also dealing with not just the lives of humans, but you're using with the lives of microbes, and then, in a sense, the lives of the plants and the animals that you're also working with. So I think that is sort of really sort of a fascinating thing. The second sort of part of fermentation and this question of spoilage that's quite fascinating, and we talked about this earlier, and this is going to be the first thing I want to have the panelists talk about, is there's this idea that somehow fermentation is trendy, but really fermentation is what we've always done as humans. There might be a moment in history right now where we are interested in fermentation or paying attention to both what fermentation does from the point of view of taste and what fermentation might help in terms of health, but also ways it might actually create problems of health that are in the 21st century seem to be particularly interesting for a lot of people, and in particular here in Vermont, we seem to be very good at fermenting things. We are very good at beer and cheese and other fermented products. So I don't know if it's something about the air or the microbes here in Vermont. I'm not sure, but another thing I'd say is that fermentation and the sort of processes of fermentation have become something that people that are involved in the making of food and drink understand, I think, increasingly, that managing fermentation well enhances flavor in a way that perhaps in earlier periods it wasn't as specific as fermentation that people thought about in terms of flavor. So one thing that I'd say, I just got back from Denmark. If you know anything about what's happening in Denmark and in Scandinavia with this something called the New Nordic Cuisine, they're extremely interested. It's a culinary movement that has created some really, really fascinating restaurants and chefs doing amazing work and very technical work, and it's premised on fermentation. And so I think that's another possible reason why you can see some of this interest in fermentation among young people that are involved in cooking and baking and making alcohol and cheese and all this, is that there's a lot of attention, cultural attention being paid to fermentation, not just in the United States, but overall. So given that, I wanted to ask each of you if you would just sort of briefly talk a little bit about, in your own processes when you're working and fermenting food, what is the relationship between the control that you have to assert in fermentation and then the creativity that you want to permit in fermentation?
So again, we focus primarily on lacto-fermented vegetables, and that means we're working with bacteria called Lactobacillica, and essentially what we're doing is taking raw, organic Vermont produce, adding just the right amount of salt to it to create a hospitable environment for this beneficial bacteria that we want to proliferate and kind of dominate the batch. So there are a lot of different variables that we use to control this. There's obviously temperature is a really big one, as to ferment at room temperature. Even the size of the vessel, a smaller vessel tends to ferment a lot faster than a larger one. The temperature changes, how much you're fluctuating tends to affect it. The variety of cabbage even, whether it's been in storage for a long time, has a little less moisture, or if it was freshly harvested, that might affect how the fermentation goes, how much moisture is in it. So we work with and control, or I don't even want to say control, but manage a lot of different variables. And the ferments can be extremely forgiving, but we're really trying to grab a hold of a certain consistency with our products. So it's kind of like a dance in a sense. Like, you know these different things, you want to try and get into their ideal space and all line up, and you come up with a perfect product every time. And so that's kind of what we're working with, creating a home for this bacteria that we want to thrive, and then the idea is that they consume all the sugars and starches and create the lactic acid that makes our vegetables sour, and the probiotics themselves are really beneficial to us. So working with that to create a consistent product, and it's just kind of a dance with it, and you learn a lot each time you do a batch.
So what we do at the bakery, and I'm mostly by myself, I have to say. I have a few people visiting, other bakers visiting, or people who like to get into sourdough visiting once in a while. But what we are doing is really, I would say, like, dive into the beauty of bread baking. And I don't know who's bread baking. Anybody out there who's baking bread? Well, anybody who does probably knows exactly what I'm talking about, because it's not only, I think, quite fascinating to bake bread, but it's also incredibly meditative, I find. I find that I tried a couple of different things in life, but I always came back to bread baking, and that seems what I can do, and it's probably something that is grounding at the same time. Then shaping a loaf of bread feels, I don't know, feels so connecting, I would say, maybe to maybe what we are as humans, perhaps because grains are one of the oldest foods that humans have been eating since we're on this planet and trying to sustain ourselves, and then figuring out what to do with grains was a whole different things, and then of course figuring out what to do with food was part of it. So I think I'm incredibly lucky to do really every day what I love to do with bread, and to transform, this like humble little kernel that's growing on a kind of a grass into one of those wonderful food items. And I think I share this with everybody who's up here, and probably most of you who's doing any fermentation at home, that you can create something incredibly delicious. And in terms of bread, for me, it's probably what is so fascinating is what really happens. And there are countless, I think, like blogs and opinions and ways of doing bread fermentation out there. If you ever go online, you'll be overwhelmed with what people are up to when they talk about bread. But I think this is really something, one of the most beautiful things that everybody can do at home. And that's why we are focusing at our bakery, we're focusing on teaching, because I think that is one of the things that everybody maybe should be making again at home, because it's so simple and it's one of the most nourishing foods you can do safely at home without much effort.
So for me, my relationship with fermentation is really primarily about flavor, right? As a chef, I'm always looking for new ingredients and maybe new combinations of flavors. And one that I've found recently is a lacto-fermented blueberry. Very simple, very straightforward. A little bit of salt, little blueberries, and you just let it sit for a few days. But what happens is you get a flavor, you get a blueberry flavor that's more blueberry than the blueberry was, which it doesn't make sense to me, but it works. And when you eat it, like, wow, this is like a really intense blueberry, but the blueberry itself wasn't that intense. So it just adds a new level of complexity to the dish that you're putting it in. And also, I kind of think back when I started as a chef. One of the first things I learned was how to make creme fraiche, and just very simple. You just leave the cream out. At the time, I was like, this doesn't make sense. Like, we're supposed to be refrigerating this; it's going to go bad. And then, we left it out, and it was great. It's just creating something new and flavorful, but also preserving at the same time, which is important. Again, going back to your kind of controlling rot, and I think of it in that way. But I also think of it as you're capturing a moment in the flavor of the food. When the food is fresh, it's one thing. When it's fermented, it's another thing. It's kind of capturing that piece.
So before I worked at these two companies, I was at Shelburne Farms for 10 years, and that's the kind of cheese where you make it one day and then 2 years later you find out whether you did a good job or not. And that was where I became very obsessive with just data collection, like qualitative, quantitative, your basics like temperature, room temperature, pH, texture, acidity, but the vibe of the room, what kind of music we were playing, basically like how many data points can I just exhaust to figure out why this cheese was incredible and this cheese wasn't, and I think that is, to me, that's fascinating. Like I said, I don't really know whether I've figured out that yet, and I think a lot of people who do fermentation kind of feel the same way. So I find that really fascinating, especially now too, because we're a farm-fed cheese operation, so to have that relationship with the cows, and now there's a whole other kind of set of data I have to collect of like, you know, boss was having a good day, feathers having a bad day, you know, all that kind of stuff. But and then another thing I find, you know, so like I think that that's a really interesting part of fermentation. It's not just like there's so many things to kind of consider. But then I think a lot of, as you were saying, like companies in Vermont have become very successful in fermentation. So just the scaling up, you know, Aqua, Vitea 10 years ago, they were making kombucha in 1 gallon batches, and now we're making kombucha in 12,000 gallon batches. And how do you maintain quality and consistency, you know, as your company becomes more successful and you have more hands, you know, making that product? I find that to be very, very interesting too. So.
Yeah, so I think that the last point, I think we can expand upon that a little bit. One thing that we've talked about is, you know, that the fermentation itself, because you are in a sense both sort of managing decay, but also trying to celebrate it, but then, you know, that means that you're involved in a lot of processes that you are not completely in control of, and that's almost what you want to have happen. You want something to happen sort of magical. I've read a lot about people talking about fermentation as a combination of art and science, that you can't only collect data points, but you can also not only say, hey, let's see what happens, you know, especially when you're talking about commercial production. And so I think what this brings up is this question of how do you scale up a fermentation process and still allow for that kind of managed chaos that is really what allows for really interesting fermentation to happen. And whether or not you, if each of you could just sort of say, are you in a situation where you feel like you are comfortable doing fermentation at a certain scale, and that would be a different process to do it differently, or any insights you have about this idea of scaling up in relationship to fermentation?
So we are actually right now kind of on the precipice of transitioning and growing, you know, another level. This is our 5th year. It's been my wife and me for this whole time, and we've been managing it really well and been growing exponentially every year. And one good piece of advice I've gotten from a lot of farmers or people in a similar line of work as us is don't grow or expand until you're busting at the seams. Like, don't do it prematurely, essentially. So this year and next year we're looking to bring on more people, and that's kind of what our bottleneck has been, is maybe just hours in a day or time to make a batch or pack out a batch or something. So for us, our ability to scale up will depend on more man hours available to us. And that's kind of the biggest one. We're doing batches anywhere from 10 gallons would be a micro experimental batch, and most of ours are 55 gallon plus. We're doing 500 pounds in a day or two, and we're looking to expand that from here. We also do kombucha on a small scale. We just sell at farmers markets, but we're looking to expand that as well. And our space still suits our needs. Eventually, when we're busting out of the seams of the physical space, we'll expand that. Right now, we're more needing man hours specifically. So we're kind of in the process of growing. The demand is still there, and we're just working to meet it. The farmers still have lots of produce when it's available. We work very seasonally, and we buy stuff when it's available.
Will it change? Will the way we ferment change?
So will the way we process? Probably not. We'll be able to cut more cabbage and salt more and stuff it into a barrel in a day with more people assisting us. But the way we do it probably will not change. We'll never probably go into a vessel larger than 55 gallons, but we might just do multiple at a time. But the manner in which we do it will probably stay the same. And we have our tried and true recipes and percentages of salt based on weight and things like that. And it's pretty scalable. So we're able to grow in that sense.
Yeah, for us it was really, there was a question, and this question always comes up, is people ask me, they come up in the summer and they say like, oh, where can I get your bread? Can I get it in Berlin? Where can I get it? And we were thinking a lot about this, but ultimately we would love to stay very small, and Actually, we are a little bit also, that our space dictates that, because we only have one wood-fired oven, and that fits about 15 loaves, and we could do like 2 firings. And also the work days are long. We get up very early and go to bed very late because of all the work that has to be done when you do like sourdough breads or naturally yeasted breads. Then you have to do a lot of steps in between, which is something if you do it all by hand. It doesn't really involve much physical labor, but it actually involves a lot of time. And sometimes I wish really the workday would have like 20 hours or 22 hours, because it's just that the time is needed to really do a good bread. And you do have to kind of work with that, the time frame, and make it right. So we are staying small because I think that's the direction that we want to go, and we'd love to see more people baking, and that's where we focus on, is more the teaching part. But I think still the production would be the same. You're thinking of, could you do say like a large scale sourdough bread production where everything is still done I'm saying the right way. There's like, it's not really a good term, where everything is done in a way that has the integrity of a full sourdough fermentation. You could. I've been to several bakeries. One really great one in San Francisco. They have about 10 bakers shaping loaves by hand in the early morning hours. So it is possible. But unfortunately, also those loaves of bread come at a price, because you have to employ like a lot of bakers who hand shape those. So there's a lot of possibilities, and we'll see where this artisan bread trend brings us. And I'm sure that there will be still growth, and because more and more people, I think, are picking up the natural bread baking again.
For the stuff we ferment in-house at the restaurants, we have the luxury of being able to work with really small batches, because we're only putting an ounce or 2 of something on a plate. So we don't need a lot, and we don't have a lot of space to store that kind of stuff. A large batch for something for us would be 5 gallons. But I think I would feel comfortable going to any scale. Basically, you're following a recipe, right? So it's all just math, and having the right equipment. So it's all pretty straightforward stuff. The important part is sanitation and technique being consistent. So that's it.
So I think that's one of the interesting things about food and fermentation, is I do think that there's an appropriate size to be for companies or businesses that are doing fermentation, because there is such a human element to it. Because at Shelburne, I've trained a lot of cheesemakers, and it took like 3 months to really get someone to feel comfortable making cheese. So it's a huge investment, and I think you can only grow to a certain size when you're doing that kind of art and science kind of work, where machines and robots can't really do that. Like in the cheese world, once you get to a certain size, you're standardizing your products. You're not really, you're standardizing your milk and everything, so you're not really, doing the same kind of stuff that, a lot of these small-scale raw milk cheesemakers would be doing. So I do think it kind of helps to keep things to a certain size, because once you kind of expand beyond that, maybe you're losing quality. In kombucha, the beverage industries, most of the ones that are out there are huge companies, and so, and kombucha in itself has only been commercially kind of popular in the last 10 years, so that's really interesting to see these, Coca-Cola interested in buying, kombucha companies, and I think that everyone's learning just on the fly of how to make kombucha on a large scale, and so I think that question of scaling up is very, very relevant in that world. But like I said, I tend to like it just because I think it means, in my mind, that we should stay a certain size, because people need to be involved in this process.
So I guess one thing I thought might be interesting for people who may not know some of the details of how fermentation differs if you're working with, let's say, an animal product or a plant product. I just wonder if any of you would feel comfortable saying something about like what is happening in the fermentation of milk to make cheese, what is happening in the fermentation to, let's say, cure a meat or something. Doug, could you talk a little bit about that? And then if anybody else has anything, I don't know, just because as we're saying, like there's many other presences when you're fermenting that you're dealing with, and the presence of these things like microbes and such can really depend upon the conditions under which you're working, and that's, people have talked about that, but also the actual raw product that you're using. So like to ferment to make beer is very different than to ferment to make kimchi in some ways, and maybe there's a lot of similarities too.
Yeah, no, you're right. You know, if you're fermenting meat, making salamis, that kind of stuff, you know, you're using different bacteria than you are if you're fermenting milk or bread or vegetables. And you know, you've got to learn what bacteria are and what the potential dangers are. And with, you know, when you're fermenting meats, you know, you have to have that specific salt or something like that, a nitrate or something, to limit the possible bad bacteria growth. You know, in a way that's similar to, you know, a lacto-ferment. You know, the salt is controlling the amount of bacteria growth, and kind of, I guess that is true across all fermentation. You know, you do want to limit the growth that you want, and you've got to learn for the specific product that you want to make what you're trying to grow and what you're trying to limit. Question or anything else?
Cheese. I'll tell what cheese now. Well, yeah. So I think with cheese making, it's I mean, the milk is really. I mean, cheese is like, you know, 99% milk. So really, that is like your raw ingredient is the most important thing. And examples like, you know, the cows are about to go down pasture. So basically, our primary ingredient is about to change completely. You know, their diet's changing, so that means the milk is changing, the components. It's all about protein and fat. You know, cheese making is basically just trying to get rid of all that water. So, so that's, you know, that's the primary thing you're focusing on. But then, I mean, I think one of the coolest things about cheese is that milk is like inherently really kind of boring and bland. But then, how many cheeses do we see at the cheese counter? It's just there's so much diversity, and so that's where the bacteria, the yeast, the microbes come in to be able to create your blue cheeses, your bloomy rind cheeses, all that kind of stuff. So that's like kind of where that piece comes into it, and then, you know, the aging environment as well. So. Milk is really inherently a very rich medium, and there's already a lot of that bacteria already in the milk, and so it's kind of the same thing as like, how do you promote the things that you want versus, you know, not, you know, making sure that you're not promoting things that you don't want. That's, you know, a part of it as well. So.
Maybe one thing I'd like to add is that what I find fascinating with bread fermentation is that there is of course, there's a host of microbes and wild yeast and lactobacilli that are fermenting foods. But what I always find fascinating is that there's one lactobacillus, Lactobacillus San Franciscensis, actually, called after the town was discovered. Is unique to cereal fermentation, so unique to bread fermentation. It has nowhere else in nature that particular lactobacillus has been found. On no food, on no other you know, food item that is fermenting, only on bread. And there's still a lot of, I think, a lot of research going on, but I just really find it fascinating that there's this one guy who's looking only for bread. or girl, I don't know. What is it like this?
Okay. So I think, well, I'm gonna ask I think I have like one question for each person, an individual question we were talking in advance. So we'll ask you each that question, and then I think we'll open it up to questions from the group. Doug, I think you were sort of saying that you're interested in this idea of fermentation being popular right now versus it being kind of this more timeless aspect of sort of making food. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or specific things you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, when I was first asked to do this panel, the question was, why do you think it's so trendy? And I don't think it is. I think, I've been dealing with it for the 20 years I've been a chef, and certain things are more popular now than they have been in the past. But ultimately, what we're talking about is, ancient technique being applied, in a modern way. But every culture has been fermenting things for thousands of years, it's great that it's trendy because it's supporting new business, and I guess people are learning health benefits and that kind of stuff. But I certainly hope it's more than just a trend, and people think about it for a lot longer, which I know they will, because another 20 years from now, somebody will be having the same conversation.
So Jason, I was wondering, like, when you think of yourself and the work that you do you think yourself somebody who grows vegetables or somebody who nurtures bacteria?
I think I'm someone who grows the bacteria or nurtures the bacteria, definitely. Our main focus and energy and time is spent in our commercial kitchen. We grow a very small percentage of what makes its way into our products, but we're really, we've borrowed the term fermentistas, and we really work on just catering to this microbial transformation that we have what we think is a pretty good grasp on knowledge and understanding how it works, but are also understanding that there are still, uncovered mysteries and little nuances that we'll continue to discover or not. But we're really just, the bacteria are the real heroes and stars of our products, and we just try and help them create something that we want, which is really sour, really fresh tasting, has the perfect texture. So it's a relationship with them.
Sometimes you're happy, sometimes you're sad. Typical relationship, right?
We definitely, I remember Kate mentioning a little bit about what mood were we in, what was the music playing. Like, we definitely very much try and just have as much of a positive energy when we're in our kitchen and project just love outwardly like we do in our daily lives, but into our food. And I think it really has a positive impact.
One thing I just want to put a plug in for one of the reasons why I personally really love that Americans are rediscovering fermentation as a positive way to deal with food and the race against rot is it's bringing back sour as a positive taste sensation. So one thing that I found really interesting in teaching students, I've taught culinary students and students at the University of Vermont, is the palate, the American palate, the one that's dominated by industrially produced foods. There's a huge amount of attention put on foods that are salty and sweet. And so we've lost a lot of a relationship to sourness and bitterness as like positive sensory experiences. And so one thing that I really love is that this process of people getting more interested in fermentation is young people are embracing sourness in a way that 10 years ago I would have really spent a lot of time trying to even get somebody to taste pickles and see them as positive other than just putting them on your hot dogs and hamburgers. So thank you all for, expanding the palate of the American people. So Heike, I think that one thing we were talking about was to what extent does using long, slow fermentation, in a sense, create ways in which foods that we rely on to eat become more digestible in some way, shape, or form?
Well, I can talk for the bread part, that studies have shown, and we're just really not there yet because there's still just so much out there, and so much information has not been fully studied or fully understood. But a lot of studies have shown that a full sourdough fermentation, I think about at least 8 hours, the best would be I think about 15 to 24 hours, is very important in bread fermentation to make bread digestible. And I think this is really what really our ancestors figured out, because bread is probably, or grains are probably the only foods that, or bread was the only food that was not developed to make it keepable. I'm thinking of like krauts or cheese were probably there, or maybe somebody figured out how to make, milk because it had such a short shelf life. But people needed food for the winter, so they figured out all ways to make food keepable for the winter. But with bread, that wasn't really necessary because you could eat grains as they were. People for 30,000 years ago were harvesting wild grasses and pounding and mashing them and eating them as a porridge. So it wasn't necessary to develop the bread making process. But when it happened, it was a host of benefits that came with it. And one was the digestibility of the grain. And the other one was that a lot of nutrients are unlocked through the fermentation process. So it was definitely, I think, something that benefited the nutrient part of eating grains. And to this day I think it's very important because a lot of people are having difficulties digesting grains, and sourdough may be something to look into, because a long fermentation is scientifically proven breaks down a lot of the proteins in the grains. The most prominent one is the one that we all know, the gluten. That is a very heavy to digest for the human digestive tract. So helping it by breaking it down through fermentation, I think is a good step. Does it work? Would it work for everybody? Probably not. So I always tell my people in class, if you know somebody who's gluten sensitive, try it. It also has other benefits, even like, it's nothing that you could go wrong with. Try it and see if it works. And in the past, you mentioned that people didn't really like, some of the fermented flavors. So sourdough bread tastes different. And I do have people say, I don't really like sourdough bread, it's too sour for me. But you also have to understand that sourdough bread doesn't necessarily have to taste sour or acidic, or like vinegar. It can, but it does not have to. And in a lot of it depends a lot of the technique. So I always give, I always tell people try it and see if it works for you, and if it works for you, great.
And so I think as a closing comment, Kate is just I wanted to ask you a little bit about what you thought of fermentation for a young person as a way to think about their future, not in terms of just what they eat, but a living that they might make for themselves.
So I came to the University of Vermont, and I didn't know what I wanted to study. I think I wanted to study food. So they didn't have that major yet, but they kind of do now. But that's where I met Amy. I took her food and culture class, and and then eventually I started working at Shelburne Farms, and I never really seriously thought about it as a career. It was like a job that you get to be able to pay rent. But I think that there is a huge need for people who are interested in food and fermentation to find a career path. I mean, I've been doing this for 12 years now, and it's been incredibly rewarding. You get to work with some really great companies, and I'd say for people who consider themselves generalists, they want to kind of do a little bit of everything. this could be a really great opportunity. You do a little bit of like microbiology, a lot of eating, a lot of tasting. You gotta go do quality control and everything like that. But I found it something that, like, when I started in 2007, I didn't ever really think it was going to be something I could turn my life's work into. And I think that especially with the growth of fermentation and whether it's cheese or beer or kombucha or whatever it is, that there's a lot of really amazing opportunity to learn the science of it. So.
If I project their voice.
I'll project. Thank you for a great discussion. I think it really put a focus and a spotlight on how important the microbiome is for our waistlines, but also I think more importantly for job growth and economic opportunity in the state. This is for all of you, and in particular, Amy, from UVM's perspective. Do you think that there's an opportunity for the state to get more involved through the public universities in funding basic science around the microbiome, not only for foods, but we've got cleaning products and center generation, and of course human health, gut health and the like. Do you think that there could be traction to try to enhance the state's image as a leader in soup to nuts microbiome?
I'd say yes, definitely. I think that when I first started making cheese, the University of Vermont had an institute for cheese making, and it eventually closed down. And I think also as a manager, it was, if I found someone that was interested in learning more about the science, even like food safety, that aspect of like how to make a safe product, there really wasn't anywhere to send them. I had to send them to Cornell, so, which I didn't do because it was expensive. But, so I think that whether it's through the state or through the universities, I think there's a lot happening, but it's in like, 6-month courses that you really can't send professionals to. So I think that there's a huge need for these companies that are growing to be able to send interested professionals who want that growth, for sure. And it doesn't exist right now, in my opinion.
So I think, I guess I would respond from the perspective of somebody who does research at UVM. I think there's two separate questions. I think the thing that Kate is bringing up, I think would be great if the state would get involved and in a sense creating professional development opportunities so that people that are interested and getting, Vermont is a place where people find it very easy to get into small business, but it's harder to stay in small business, and a lot of times it's regulations, it's there's technical knowledge that you don't realize you need to know, but when you get into it, especially dealing with supply chains and other things, there's knowledge you really need to know about food safety, about quality control and all these things, and there's no question that would be great, and it's not, that it has to be a public-private and maybe a government venture to make that happen, and I think that would be great. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for it. I think there's this very interesting thing that's happening in different forms of research in microbiology about this idea of the microbiome, and I know that there's a lot of people that are interested in understanding it from the point of view of human health. Whether or not there's something integrated there that that Vermont could be very specifically well known about, I mean, go in and pitch to, the head of the med school, see what you can do. I don't know of anything going on right now that is integrated. And I will tell you that one thing that is so fascinating about, and I'm going to this is my point of view, so don't quote me on this in any way, but what is so really fascinating about what's happening from my point of view and being in a nutrition and food science department is the medical profession and the health sciences in general don't understand, or they don't pay attention to that set of relationships between what happens with the food that goes in your body and what's happening internally in your body, and then sort of health states in a way that is as sophisticated as it maybe could be. And there are ways in which some of this work by people who are on the ground making certain kinds of foods could contribute to that knowledge. And that's not happening. Those conversations, Kate and Heike are not talking to GI doctors on a regular basis. That kind of conversation is not happening. And Vermont is the kind of place where we're small enough and there's sort of enough co-discussion about things. That's a possibility for sure. That would be really interesting to see happen.
Maybe I can add one thing is that you all probably noticed that I have this weird accent, so I'm not from the United States. I'm originally from Germany, and I grew up in part of my studies were in Denmark. And I actually just returned from Europe, and I saw this this fascinating and development in Denmark, which is a super small country. That was really, and you mentioned it at the beginning, that they are really now at the forefront of really developing or even working with ways of bringing new food into people's minds that I've never imagined that would happen 20 years ago. There are great chefs there, there are great bakers there are great professionals there who transformed the whole food landscape. So do I think Vermont could do this? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think if this small state already has a reputation of really great products, and I think this could happen because I've seen it happening in Denmark and it influenced the whole world.
How about in the back there, and then you, and then you?
I have a question for Kate. It has to do with maple syrup. I want to know if you ever tried to use maple syrup in your kombucha product as the item to get fermented. The reason I ask that is because there's a lot of commercial grade maple syrup that either gets thrown out or sold for about $75 cents a pound. And I believe it worked well for fermentation. I personally use maple syrup to ferment water kefir, and it works out well.
So Aqua, at least in my understanding, we've never done that before. I know of a company in Middlebury, though, that uses honey to ferment kombucha. But I'm sure there's someone out there that does it, and I think that would be a really great because kombucha really, you buy in tea, you buy in sugar. These are not Vermont-based products, so I think that would be really, really fascinating. But as of right now, no, Aqua is not doing that. So
You think I might go into practice?
Maybe I'll suggest it tomorrow. I'll go in. Yeah. No, I think it's like I said. I think we try to use as many Vermont products as we can, and some of like the added flavors and everything. But I think that it's definitely that could be a really great way to continue to work towards that.
So just to touch on that, one thing that I love and I've made many times is maple vinegar. And it's not something that's readily available on the market. So if anybody out there wants to start a maple vinegar company, we more than happily pay $30, $40 a gallon for it.
Speaking of sour and public taste, this question might start with you, but it might go to everybody. I was taught that things like broccoli, a long time ago, the varieties used to be more bitter or sour, probably bitter, and that factory farming, if I should call it that, evolved to a milder broccoli. So one question is that, are you aware if that's true? And the rest of my question is, what are all the panelists in relationship to public taste? Do you see it changing? Do you try to educate your customers? How do you relate to the wide potential taste of what you're making and what your public wants to buy?
I think we have definitely seen a widespread of industrial agriculture really pushing for much sweeter, potentially more bland vegetables, really very much in favor of like pest and disease resistance and yield and much less, and appearance, and much, much less about flavor. I think, 20 years ago or more, we had a huge diversity of vegetables that were commonly planted by farmers who served the community, and now that number is much, much smaller. I think the variety of vegetables is much diminished, and I think that they have definitely become slightly more bland with certain ones and definitely sweeter. Corn is a big example. The sweet corn today is almost like a candy compared to the sweet corn way back when. So I definitely have noticed that trend and have spoken to enough farmers who can speak a lot more to it. I think what we do is trying to bring back flavors that maybe the human body kind of knows inside that it really wants and likes. I have a very concrete example of that. When I sample a lot at farmers markets and it's someone's first trying sauerkraut, even before they try it, they say, oh, I don't like it. And I say, well, we have this one kind, it's not as spicy, more ginger, you might like it. And then they try it and they're like, I don't know, that's pretty good. And they walk away and they come back. This happens all the time. And they're like, I just started to crave it after I tasted it. And then we have people who come back the next week and we're like, I finished the whole bottle in like 2 days. I don't know what happened. And I explained to them, I said, yeah, this has been my experience. The human body tends to crave things it knows are good for it. So these sour flavors might at first be like kind of an off taste, but then they become like craved and really good, and it's like a healthy addiction to have. Along with bitters, I mean, human beings have been eating extremely bitter food for a long time, and only in the last several decades has that been almost eliminated from our diet in terms of how regular it was. So with our business, we're trying to reintroduce these things that we know people will love if they just give it a chance or maybe a second chance, and then usually they're like, wow, I actually do like that flavor even though I thought I didn't.
I can share one story that happens often when we go on tasting, bread tasting, and I do this often in Europe when I'm over there and on some tasting events, and we are all told to stop eating salt for 24 hours before we go into these tasting rounds, because our palates have been so accustomed to salt that we are almost over-salting a lot of, I guess many foods, that we don't really know a good level anymore of saltiness and can have a hard time distinguishing between that's normal and that's too salty. And that you're probably more aware of that like in terms of culinary, what's the common thing there?
I think that is valid. We obviously always season everything to the maximum level, because that's what tastes the best. There's something that when you go to a great restaurant and you've had a meal, and there's just something about it that's different. You're like, this is really great, and it's because the chef and the cooks have taken the time to seek out those vegetables that taste better, whether it's an heirloom variety of something or whether it's just a super fresh anything. It's our job to find those ingredients and to give them to the people. And it is true that your general grocery store vegetables are pretty much garbage. There's a lot of science coming up. Grocers are going to start measuring the bricks levels of vegetables and fruits, and then it has to do with nutrient density, because, like Jason said, everything has been bred for yield, and now finally people are coming back around like, hey, there's more to this than just how much of this we can grow. How good does it taste? How good is it for you? We do search out those varieties of things and bring them back. I'm a member of Slow Food, and in that organization they have the Arc of Taste, which is a list of food products that are endangered of disappearing, and most of those products are heirloom varieties of vegetables that people don't grow anymore because the yield wasn't great, but the flavor was really much better. And you know, there are a lot of people working on getting those things back. It just takes, you know, everybody going to the farmer's market to get their vegetables rather than the grocery store. No offense to anybody. As far as grocery stores go, they are the best around, and they do have the best quality produce.
We talked about this race against Brot. I was curious about how each maybe you want to do what's your process of fermentation that increases your shelf life in each of your products?
So, our fermented vegetables are very forgiving if you know how to work with them in the right way and manage the variables. If we're following a tried and true recipe that's scalable, we add the right amount of salt, and we're able to control the temperature in our room, it can ferment almost indefinitely. I've heard of some, like German sauerkrauts, that ferment for 2 years before they're even jarred. So we have a lot of leeway, I guess, in that, and we taste them once they've gone for a number of weeks or a month or two. We start to taste them, and our biggest gauge of determining whether it's ready is how sour it tastes, on top of like look, smell, sight, texture, things like that. But the more it ferments, the more sour it gets typically. There's other things. How much salt we add in the beginning will affect the length of the fermentation or how long it takes to get to that sourness. More salt usually is a longer fermentation. Lower temperature fermenting is usually a longer. So if we can kind of understand those, we're able to taste the product as it's aging, and then we can jar it, and it stores in a room like anything below 55 degrees. So we don't even necessarily need cooler temperatures. So it's pretty forgiving in that sense, and we're able to just sort of watch it.
Milk is very perishable. So with cheese making, it's all about getting rid of water because milk is like 85% water. So with different cheeses, you'll use different techniques. You'll have like different tools in your tool belt to be able to get rid of water. So if you're making a cheddar, you want that to last, 2 years, or even like if you're Wisconsin, like 30 years. So you're going to do different things throughout your production day to be able to take that water away from the curd. If you're making a cheese like what we have over there, like a soft, runny cheese, you want to have a little more water in there because we actually want to sell that sooner. So, but yeah, like I said, it's all just trying to take that water away from the milk.
What about just the milk? Like it's also, what do you have to do to make sure that the milk is good before you make it into the cheese?
I mean, how do you make good milk? Oh no.
Perishability. Because he's talking about what do you have to make sure that it's static so that it'll ferment correctly and you'll get the right process?
Oh, so like setting it up, like I guess.
Is it temperature?
Oh yeah, temperature. You need to have lactic acid bacteria because you need to, produce an acidic environment. So, milk has lots of lactose in it. So converting that milk sugar into lactic acid, so you create an acidic environment so that things don't grow. So yeah, I've kind of simplified it a little bit. So yeah, so basically you want to, create acid in there, lower the pH, and then, remove the water and then add salt to it. So it's, similar to, a lot of our other processes. But there's a combination of a few different things that you need to be able to create the right structure and environment so that it will last for a long amount of time. And that's, there's some cheeses that will last 2 days and other ones that will last 30 years, which again is why cheese is just so incredible.
With bread, it's quite easy. If you've probably all picked up a baguette once in your life, and had that, and it's great when it's fresh. And what does it taste like 2 days later? It's a really it's very hard, and it's one of those white breads that really don't keep very well. And no offense to the baguette, I love baguettes, and they're great, super tasty breads. But they're traditionally made with yeast, with commercial yeast or baker's yeast, whereas sourdough bread often keeps for about 10 days. And if you talk to old folks, they've had bread sometimes for 3 or 4 weeks, without it getting really bad or starting to mold. And the reason for that is the sourdough fermentation. So it's pretty striking. When you take the sourdough fermentation out of bread, the bread really starts molding within 1 week. If you add preservatives, of course, that wouldn't happen. So the reason why most of the breads in the supermarkets don't mold is because they have preservatives. But if you're baking at home, if you're baking sourdough, your bread easily keeps for over a week.
Jason, you mentioned that excuse me, when you scale the container, results will vary. Are you seeing that also like on a home scale, meaning like people doing it at home? And if so, is there any suggestions on how to adjust for that or correct for that?
So when I've noticed a difference with the size of vessels, I'm comparing things from like a 5-gallon to like even a 30-gallon, not even all the way up to the 55. I'm not sure how that would translate comparing, say, a pint versus a gallon, if there would be as much of a difference. I imagine that those two slightly very small vessels would ferment at a similar amount of time. But I sort of suspect it's just the mass volume of the product, the bacteria just kind of spreading and growing throughout the way like mycelium might fill out for a mushroom bag. And I also think that the temperature, for it to come to that warmer temperature, just takes a lot longer because it's so much more vegetables and it's so much more room to get to the center. So I'm not sure how that would necessarily scale down to a home measure. Like if you wanted kimchi in 10 days, is it better to do it in 10 pints rather than a few quarts? I'm not sure on that.
Actually, in closing, thank you for asking that question because it makes me think, if you all were going to give people in the audience like one tip about doing some fermentation at home, like what would you have, like a sage word of advice about fermentation? And sort of, because it's that combination of art and science and control and chaos, like is there anything you could do? Because I think a lot of times people are afraid of fermentation. I'm actually personally a little afraid of it, but I have people in my life who are good at it, but I wonder if other people have, if you have any suggestions.
I think I was initially attracted to fermented vegetables specifically because once we moved to Vermont, we're really keen on eating local year-round and preserving a lot of our produce. So we got into freezing and drying and canning and a little fermentation. And even though canning was more common, it was almost more overwhelming with all the regulations and the possibility of botulism and stuff like that. But fermented vegetables are so much safer. There's really no risk of botulism. There's too much salt. It's too acidic. Are kind of the main reasons. And so it almost felt easier or more approachable. It's much older of a tradition of preserving foods. People were doing it, for thousands of years, whereas canning is relatively new. So it just felt more approachable. And I also view it, aside from the eating local, which is a big part of our household, but we're sort of producing our own medicine. Buying the vegetables from these farmers and making this healthful bacteria that's good for our guts and our brains and all that. It can be very approachable. A little bit of cabbage, a little bit of salt, and a little bit of time at the right temperature.
I would say for making bread at home is one of the easiest things that anybody can do, and it's also it's probably one of the safest, I would think, because like what you were saying, just not much can go wrong, because even like if you would have a sourdough starter culture at home and you got like some unwanted bacteria in there, those are mostly killed off in the baking process. I have not heard anything that gone wrong with bread, basically bread baking and sourdough baking, because they are not heat resistant, at least most of the bacteria that I'm aware of. And so I think anybody can try it and play around with the sourdough. The only thing that you might encounter is maybe not the perfect bread that you would like it, but that that is something that takes a lifetime of fun and just exploring sourdough baking, and that's part of it too.
I would say, go out and find the thing that you like, right? Like whether you're trying to make a kimchi or a wine or whatever it is you're trying to do, find the one that you like, and then trust your instincts. And if what you made doesn't quite look right, try it again. It's pretty apparent when something has gone wrong. It's generally mold or something else that smells really awful. So, trust your instincts.
Yeah, I don't think I'm the best person to ask about this because I think I've never really done much stuff at home because I think I've always been my 9 to 5. I think there was a time I made 700 pounds of cheddar one day and then I came home to make a pound of mozzarella and it didn't work. but I think that there's like so many great resources out there. Like there's so many books now about how to do this stuff in your house. Like The Art of Fermentation is a really good one. And I mean for cheese making, for home cheesemakers, there's like so many great books and forums, people are getting really into it. And for kombucha, I think that, like I said, kombucha's only been available commercially for the last 10 years. Before that, you probably all had friends that had the jar and the SCOBY. That's how people got their kombucha. And I think that's something that people always think is you need to have a friend that has a SCOBY so you can get a kombucha. But you can actually, if you were to buy Aqua by Tea kombucha, the teetotaler, which doesn't have any of the juice in it, just put it into a container. A SCOBY will naturally form because all the yeast and bacteria are in there because it's raw. So if you just leave it out at room temperature, that SCOBY pad will actually form. So you don't even need to know a friend that will give you a SCOBY to start making your own kombucha. So that's really cool. But.
Front Porch Forum also has lots of SCOBYs. That's where we've got most of our times.
They're a sponsor.